Hello, I'm Ian, and I've been researching my family tree over the last year or so. I must admit I'm not easily shocked or starstruck, but I was a bit taken aback when I found ancestors living in castles, rectories, log cabins, lunatic asylums and prisons. No murderers though. Not to mention family living everywhere from Siberia to India to Denmark to Alaska to Finland to New Zealand. Sadly, a lot of the ancestors just exist in the form of names, but the names themselves do conjure up quite a picture. Lancelot Young, Providence Leonardo, Edygius Goff, Isabella Camel, Lydia Slaymaker, and His Grace John Manners, Lord Roos, Marquess of Granby, Duke of Rutland. That's just one person, by the way. Let's start logically with the peacocks themselves. And the surname Peacock was originally a nickname for a pompous dandy. No comment. As for our branch of the peacocks, I've so far got back to the 1530s, the time of Henry VIII. For centuries they lived in North Yorkshire, in Swaledale and Arkengarthdale, in villages such as Reeth, Grinton, Mooker, Keld and Crackpot. Yes, Crackpot. Dominated by a ruined farmhouse called Crackpot Hall, where a wild child was found in the 1930s wandering round with a pet puppy, a pet fox and 2 white cats. Reeth was famous for its lead mines, and most of the locals were lead miners or farmers or both. Let's start tracing the peacock tree in the early 20th century, when my granddad, Ernest Peacock, was a mine manager at North Walbottle Pit, to the west of Newcastle. On Sundays he played the organ at a local church, and in the First World War he was a flight engineer on a biplane flying mostly over France. On one rather dramatic trip the plane landed in a field, but they couldn't take off again because the field was too small, so they removed the wings, dragged the entire wingless plane out through the gate, reassembled it and flew off. My great-grandad James and great-grandma Mary were born in Victorian times and lived seemingly quiet lives, having moved from North Yorkshire to County Durham, where he was a mine manager. Among other things, he was well known for his deafening singing voice in church. And then, unbelievably, in their 60s, they decided to up sticks and emigrate to New Zealand. At that point, they were living in Bishop Auckland. The place they were heading for was Auckland, minus the Bishop, on North Island. In the summer of 1927, they travelled 11,000 miles by ship, the SS Tanui. The journey would have taken about 6 weeks. And when they arrived, they literally set up shop with a general store. Great-grandma Mary died 10 years later, but great-grandad James lived to the 1950s. Their son, my great-uncle Arthur, went out to join them. Dad visited him on a New Zealand trip in the 1980s and said he was very good company, but an alarmingly fast driver. Devonport, where the New Zealand peacocks lived, is a picturesque seaside village with cute colonial houses and some very popular beaches. Before the dramatic New Zealand move, the Peacock family rarely strayed from North Yorkshire, living there for about 3 centuries. So locating them has been pretty easy, but researching their various connections hasn't. There were endless Thomases, Jameses, Williams, Marys and Elizabeths, and they all lived in the same small area around Reeth at roughly the same time, with overlapping lifelines and numerous marriages of couples who had exactly the same 2 names. And so the Peacock line goes back via endless Thomases, Jameses, Williams, Marys and Elizabeths, plus one Vincent, to the 16th century, 1530, and the birth of Johannes Peacock, my great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-granddad. That's 13 greats. He's officially recorded as Johannes, but was probably just John to his friends. And surprise, surprise, Johannes, or John, also lived in North Yorkshire. There are lots of records of peacocks in the area before Grandad Johannes in the 16th century, but I can't really guarantee that they're direct ancestors. The most notorious one was Anthony Peacock from Grinton. He was a leading figure in the Pilgrimage of Grace, a movement opposed to Henry VIII and the Church of England. He was hanged on Richmond Moor in 1536. More recently, in the 20th century, there was Susan Peacock from Reeth, who I like to think is a relative of some sort. From 1903, she was the terrifying landlady of England's highest pub, the Tan Hill Inn. She famously kept a loaded pistol behind the bar to frighten off misbehaving drinkers, and she became a radio personality in the 1930s, broadcasting from the pub itself. The Tan Hill Inn has featured in various films such as Wuthering Heights and several adverts. My Grandma Peacock's maiden name was Chapman. The Chapmans were from County Durham, Bishop Auckland, Staindrop, Hamsterley, Brantsmouth and Cockfield. Great-Grandma Elizabeth Chapman was apparently tiny. She lived at Grandad and Grandma Peacock's house in Westerhope, and she used to enjoy watching cars pass, one by one, with long gaps down Stamfordham Road. Her father, my great-great-grandad, William Chapman, married 3 times. Great-Grandma Chapman's mum was a Parry. The Parrys were also from County Durham, and before that, London. In September 1733, my great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandad, James Parry, married Esther Edwards, but not in a church. They were married in the chapel of the notorious Fleet Prison, a debtors' prison in Clerkenwell. But don't panic, that doesn't mean they were prisoners. In the 18th century, about half of the marriages in London were conducted in the Fleet Prison Chapel. A lot of them were so-called clandestine marriages, which weren't accepted by normal churches because there was some sort of element of secrecy or family disapproval. And so on to the other side, Mum's family. Let's start with Mum's mum, my grandma, who was born in Illing. Illing is a popular Buckinghamshire surname, and 99% of my Illing ancestors came from Great Horwood or Little Horwood, villages in Buckinghamshire. My great-grandad Albert Illing was born in 1879 and was a pioneer of early plastics, including Bakelite. He became the managing director of the plastics company Eben Nestos, which, among other things, produced Bakelite-type components for Royal Air Force planes which were flying in World War II. The company was based in an Art Deco building in South London and pioneered the manufacture of early 78 RPM records, producing 200,000 discs per month in the guise of the Homophone, Homochord and Sterno labels. One of their early signings was Mantovani and his Typica Orchestra. Along with my great-grandma Jessica, or Jessie, he lived in Bromley. The area was bombed heavily during the Second World War. In a rather tinny oral history recording, Mum's cousin, the Reverend Eric Illing, recalls living in the area constantly bombed by doodlebugs and V2s.
I vividly remember on the first day of the war, on the Sunday morning, the siren going very loudly in the area, and my father rushing out of the house and placing precautions against the window in case we were going to be bombed and blasted. We used to follow the progress of the war later on with maps on the dining room wall with little flags, and we could see how the forces were advancing in North Africa and later through Europe, and each day we would listen to the news and put out our little flags to see what was happening overseas. Another favourite occupation of children at that time was collecting shrapnel, and I had an enormous collection of shrapnel which fell all over the place in Beckenham, and we used to swap bits of shrapnel at school. I'll have this bit of brass for that bit of steel or whatever. We used to play on the bomb sites, and I remember vividly exploring different bomb sites in the area after bombs had fallen, and if my parents had known, I think they'd have had a heart attack.
Every morning, great-grandad Albert set off for his office with a rose or a flower of some sort in his buttonhole. Concealed under his lapel was a tiny silver vase full of water to keep the flower fresh.
Come into the garden, Maud, for the black-bat night has flown.
Great-grandma Jessie had previously been married to Charles Chambard from France, who died in 1899. So great-grandad Albert's stepdaughters, Dolly and Mabel, were half French. I know nothing about Charles Chambard, but the name Chambard originates in the mountainous Auvergne region, which is north of Provence. I've managed to trace the Illings back as far as the 15th century, and Henry Illing, born in 1475. They nearly all lived in Great and Little Horwood. Great-aunt Dolly Illing was my grandma's elder sister. In the 1920s, Auntie Dolly was working at the Great Northern Telegraph Company in London, where she met and married a Danish telegraphy engineer, Peter Theodor Octavius Christiansen Tversted, who I always knew as Uncle Teddy. Uncle Teddy was born in Skagen, as we call it, but I think they call it Skjern in Denmark, at the far northern tip of Jutland. His father was the harbour pilot, guiding ships in and out. As a child, Uncle Teddy spent endless days on the beach, famous for a 14th century church which was buried in the sand until only the top of the tower could be seen. In 1919, he was posted by the Great Northern Telegraph Company to Moscow, 2 years after the Russian Revolution. He and his colleagues were fantastically rich compared to the poor Russians and used to drink champagne at the Metropole Hotel. He also managed to buy quite a few Romanov treasures which he kept in a bank vault. After marrying Auntie Dolly, he was posted to Omsk in Siberia, where the winter lasts for about 7 months and temperatures can plummet to minus 45 degrees. But they still opened all the windows once a week during the winter, which was a traditional way of ventilating the house. They had quite a few visits from the Secret Service, and there was a heavy army presence in the city. One night they were woken up by deafening gunfire for hours on end. The next morning, the hundreds of urchins who used to live on the streets had mysteriously all disappeared. Uncle Teddy's work then took him to Helsinki, where Auntie Dolly sadly died. Grandma's younger sister Betty visited to look after the children for a while. Before long, they got married and moved to a village called Esbjerg near Elsinore in Denmark. Mum's dad, my granddad, Lewis Lloyd, was born in 1898. In 1917 he signed up during the First World War and served in Egypt, where at the age of 19 he learnt to drive and caught malaria. But for a while mystery surrounded his father, William Lloyd. As a child in the 1930s, Mum was always told that William Lloyd, her granddad, my great-granddad, was dead. But she was aware that her dad and grandma often used to head off for mysterious visits to Northumberland. And then, in the early 40s, she visited Grandad William's grave. On the gravestone, it said he died on the 27th of January 1940 in Stannington near Morpeth. Something was amiss. It turned out that he hadn't died at all when she was told, but had spent years in a psychiatric hospital, St Mary's. He'd had a brain injury years earlier. Apparently he was quite happy in the hospital and spent his days looking after the gardens and greenhouses. It was, by all accounts, quite progressive. Patients went on trips to the seaside, there were concert parties, musicals, dancers and sing-alongs in the theatre. The The doctors formed a band and performed for the patients, and there was an annual sports day. According to family folklore, the Lloyds were from Wales, which they probably were centuries ago, but the more recent ones were from London, from Marylebone. My great-great-granddad, William Lloyd, was born in Marylebone in 1827 and was clearly quite a character. In 1848, he ended up in prison for 4 months for larceny. As far as I can tell, that's petty theft. In those days, 4 months was pretty lenient, so thankfully it can't have been terribly serious. I've traced the Lloyds back to 1778, when Robert Lloyd was born, again in Marylebone. But the Lloyd saga is far from over, and we'll be tracing the Alaska branch a little bit later. Meanwhile, here I am in North Yorkshire with Mum, my great-aunt Jane and Aunt Evelyn. In 1919, great-aunt Jane married Richard de Roos Norman, and so begins another incredible branch of the tree. Uncle Richard was from an aristocratic family going back to 1066 and directly descended from Richard III's sister, Anne Plantagenet.
A horse! A horse! My kingdom for a horse!
Her daughter Anne and her husband, George Manners, Baron de Roos, were Aunt Evelyn's 13th great-grandparents, and they still reside in a magnificent tomb in St George's Chapel, Windsor. Uncle Richard was born in southern India, or possibly even Sri Lanka, in the days of the Raj. He owned a tea plantation. The de Roos Normans lived in the south of India, in Kerala and Tamil Nadu, and spent the hot season from March to June in the cooler area of Uttakamund, or Ooty, where the hills reminded them of England. Among other things, the family built hospitals, boarding schools, gentlemen's clubs, stately homes and churches. Before moving to India, Aunt Jane was a nurse, and in the First World War she served on a hospital ship, the Britannic, which was the sister ship of the Titanic, used to transport injured servicemen from the Mediterranean to the UK. In 1917, Aunt Jane resigned. Her reason was to take a course in massage, which may sound a bit odd, but she was actually helping to promote early physiotherapy. She received the Mons Star and Victory Medals for her pioneering work in wartime medicine. In India, she helped run a leper hospital, among other things. Life in India was pretty dramatic by all accounts. In 1921, Uncle Richard was caught up in the Malabar Rebellion, a Muslim rebellion against Hindus and the British, and he had to hide in the jungle where he caught malaria. Here's the family bungalow in Kerala, which is now apparently a tourist attraction. The children, Evelyn and Ranulph, seemingly had an idyllic childhood in India, looked after by an ayah, a nanny. Auntie Evelyn's favourite activity was to ride on an elephant, and when she stood on top of one of the elephant's toenails, he'd lift up his leg so she could climb straight onto his head. There were plenty of dangerous animals around as well, and Uncle Richard once shot a panther which approached Evelyn's cot in the garden, looking hungry. In 1947, Uncle Richard was forced to flee India, and many of the family's possessions had to be left behind. He died from malaria a year later. Ranulph and Evelyn lived in India during the holidays, but had to sail back to the UK to attend boarding school in term time. The journey took 5 weeks. Ranulph went to Cheltenham College, Evelyn was at Lowther College, which was based in Bodelwithan Castle. I remember her telling me about the flying fish en route. Her dad, Uncle Richard, seemingly spent half his life on ships. There are endless records of his voyages to and fro between Sri Lanka, India, Burma, now called Myanmar, and the UK. But sadly, I've discovered quite a few tragedies at sea. In the Spence branch of the family tree, Auntie Marjorie's father, William, was a highly successful seafarer. But the records show he was laid to rest not in his native Tynemouth, but in Argentina, in Villa Constitucion on the Paraná River. He'd died at sea in August 1938. As for the HMHS Britannic, which Aunt Jane served on, the ship was designed with special modifications to make her immune to icebergs, unlike her unfortunate twin, the Titanic. But in November 1916, the Britannic sank in the Aegean Sea. Over 1,000 people survived, but 30 passengers didn't. Aunt Jane wasn't on board at the time. In 1976, the celebrity ocean explorer Jacques Cousteau found the wreck just a few hundred feet below the surface and declared that the Britannic had probably hit a German mine, planted by Kapitän Leutnant Gustav Zeiss. Not sure I like the look of him, frankly. Another maritime mystery surrounded Ranulph and Evelyn's Uncle Harry, who was a chief officer on various ships in the South China Sea. Why, I wondered, was he buried in Hong Kong in the so-called Happy Valley Cemetery? And then I stumbled on an inscription which revealed that he'd been murdered by pirates on the 17th of January 1928 while serving as chief officer on a ship called the Sam Nam Ho. They were Chinese pirates, so they obviously didn't look like the Gilbert and Sullivan ones. Presumably Uncle Ranulph knew all about this when he moved back home on leaving school and promptly decided to run away to sea. In a letter, he describes joining the Merchant Navy in 1942, shaking hands with his mum and Jane, and then never returning to England until 1978. He mostly sailed on Norwegian ships, working as a radio operator. During the Second World War, they crossed the Atlantic in convoys, which were often hit by German torpedoes. And if it was foggy, the ships would accidentally ram into each other. He was fascinated by the icebergs and the ice floes they sailed past en route to Nova Scotia. And he entertained himself by listening to Make-Believe Ballroom Time on a station called WNEW.
It's make-believe ballroom time. Put all your cares away. All the bands are here to bring good cheer your way. It's make-believe ballroom time, and free to everyone. It's no time to fret, your dial is set for fun. Good morning, everybody.
On August the 19th, 1943, he was on the MV Santos. It was foggy with zero visibility, and suddenly there was a huge bang. The ship's two teenage mess boys knocked on Ranulph's door to ask what was happening. He said he had no idea, but it might be a good idea not to return to their cabins in the bowels of the ship. However, they went back below. As he wrote in his account, little did they, or we, know that they were going to their deaths within minutes. Because at that moment there was a deafening crash. The alarm bells sounded, and Uncle Ranulph writes, the ship shuddered and heeled over as much as 20 degrees. There was no mistaking at this time, the end was near. They were ordered to abandon ship and board the lifeboats. But thankfully, Uncle Ranulph had the presence of mind to grab a spare transmitter and a battery. As he wrote, I threw the transmitter into the lifeboat. Up the lifeboat came, off I went into the darkness and plummeted squarely into the boat. The ship resembled in the darkness a gigantic Egyptian obelisk, a ghostly monument with water cascading down its sides. The Santos slipped down into the sea with scarcely a ripple to mark her grave. There were just two casualties, Dennis Perry, 17, and Robert Walker, 18. Thankfully, the lifeboat transmitter worked and the survivors were rescued by the HMS Narcissus, which was heading for St John's. However, they couldn't get into the harbour thanks to a huge iceberg. So they boarded a former cruise liner, the Fort Townsend, and headed for New York. The ship's steward still thought he was on a cruise, though, in his head, and announced mealtimes by playing Deep in the Heart of Texas on his xylophone.
Deep in the heart of Texas. Deep in the heart of
Once they were on dry land in New York, the ship's captain, Mons Augustadt, sent a telegram to President Roosevelt saying,
Norwegian crew just rescued from sunk Norwegian motor ship, ready to continue fighting. Please help us with a new ship.
The telegram actually reached the president himself. He was apparently very impressed and said, "These are the kind of people who will win the war." And he did give them a new ship. But back to England, and Uncle Ranulph's granddad was George de Roos Norman. George's mum was Lady Elizabeth Isabella Manners, and his wife was his cousin, Louisa Manners. The de Roos Norman and the Manners family were pretty interchangeable at that point. George and Louisa lived at the Elms in Melton Mowbray, which was the Norman family home, but then they moved to Goadby Marwood Hall. Meanwhile, Louisa's father, the elderly Reverend Edward Manners, lived nearby in Goadby Parsonage, and there was a bit of a problem. Louisa's sister, Anne Manners, lived with the Reverend Edward and basically couldn't stand Louisa. So one day when Louisa visited the parsonage, she was attacked by two grooms and a servant. The trial even became the subject of a book, A Hiatus of the Rectory. George's father, Richard de Roos Norman MP, was a keen horseman, and he often rode with the beaver hunt. There's even an alarming description of him in the memoirs of the Beaver Hounds.
Full gallop through Goadby there came, a red coat on a grey mare, so eager that Halt, blind and lame, ran out to see who could be there. "Have you seen the hounds here?" he cried, and spurring flanked on the old nag. "It is Squire Norman so wild, and fairly worn out to a rag."
Richard had 2 wives and 17 children, and lived till he was 89. Or, as the Beaver Hounds poet would no doubt put it,
Richard had 2 wives and 17 children, and lived till he was 89.
The Manners and de Roos Normans lived in various country houses, but the grandest was Belvoir Castle, and the most famous family member was Lady Diana Manners, who was a major celebrity in the early 20th century. She knew Nancy Mitford and Evelyn Waugh, who both based characters on her. She appeared in several silent films, including The Glorious Adventure, filmed unbelievably in colour in 1922. And The Virgin Queen the next year, in the title role of Queen Elizabeth I. She then became addicted to morphine, did a bit of nursing, and married Alfred Duff Cooper, 1st Viscount Norwich, who was an ambassador and cabinet minister under Churchill. Their 90-page wedding list included presents from Queen Alexandra, Lord Beaverbrook, and Dame Nellie Melba.
If you ask me what the morale at Great Britain is at the present time, my only criticism of it is that it's almost too high.
They lived all over the world, but her favourite places were Algiers and Little Venice. plus a tiny smallholding with just one cow. She got very attached to the cow and refused to leave as long as it was still there.
Lady Diana, as a child you used to stay with your grandfather, the Duke of Rutland, at Belvoir Castle. You must have experienced there a kind of life that just doesn't go on anymore.
The life
Yes.
could not be more different. Vast staff, enough staff to make a choir in the chapel. Terrible choir, but still it was a choir of housemaids and footmen. And
There were night watchmen on the estate too, were there not?
yes, there were the night watchmen. I don't know whether they exist at all today, but we had great comfort at night, hearing the gravel crunch under the night watchman's foot, and he'd call out, "Past 12 o'clock, all's well," and that gave us comfort.
Your mother was a very talented artist, wasn't she?
She was very talented. All day long she played the piano. Not all that well, but plodding away at a score, and generally Wagner.
After you came out, you had a reputation for being one of the wild ones, one of the first of the bright young things.
Yes, it's very difficult to believe why, but I suppose I did. And I don't quite know why, but I always had publicity.
Before that, you did in fact become a film star, didn't you?
Oh yes, but I've forgotten it. It was so bad.
Having been a swinging teenager yourself, do you think they're overdoing it today?
I don't think I know, because as you tell me, I was swinging then and I didn't know it.
The book she chose was her own autobiography, and her luxury was a bag of pillows, so she could smuggle her dog inside it onto the island. And finally, from an imaginary desert island to the Arctic Circle and the Alaskan branch of the family. In 1898, aged just 23, my great-great-uncle, Lewis Lloyd, left his family home at 4 Bloomfield Terrace in Gateshead and boarded a ship to America. He'd heard rumours about vast quantities of gold being found around the Kobuk River in northwest Alaska, 30 miles north of the Arctic Circle. And along with 2,000 others, he joined the so-called Kobuk Gold Stampede. Most of them gave up, but he stayed and discovered gold at a place called Dahl Creek. His final ship on the journey to Kobuk was the Victoria. He then met and married great-great-aunt Ella, who was from Brooklyn in New York, and they lived in a log cabin in the middle of nowhere. They seemed to be permanently dressed in furs, from reindeers, ptarmigans and chinchillas. The most iconic sight in the area is the Great Kobuk Sand Dunes, which rise unexpectedly out of the trees. They're inland dunes and date back to the Ice Age. Caribou or reindeer migrate across the Kobuk Valley. And most of the area's inhabitants were Inupiat Native Americans. There was a so-called Eskimo school nearby, run by a prim-looking Miss Lefelt. Skating was the most popular activity in the winter. A chap called Karl Knobelsdorff was known as the Flying Dutchman and became an ice skating courier, delivering mail to and from winter camps on the river. But the local Huskies did most of the transportation. These are the Huskies Uncle Lewis and Aunt Ella used. When they weren't wearing animals, they were keeping them. They had a pet rabbit, pet chinchillas, and a dog called Ned, who looked more like a mini wolf. Uncle Lewis became one of the most successful gold prospectors in the region, and of course had a weighing scale in the cabin. Lewis never left Kobuk, never returned to England, and eventually became a notary public. That's an impartial witness employed by the government for when important documents are signed. Thankfully, Lewis and Ella were keen photographers, letter writers and diarists, and now there's a Lewis Lloyd archive in the University of Fairbanks in Alaska. Their archivist, called Fawn, helpfully sent me some photos and a few notes, but the letters and diaries are too fragile to scan, so I'll have to personally visit the archive to see them one day. So they were pretty well documented, but there was still a mystery. Various references to their daughter, called Jenny. I couldn't find her in any records though. However, there were some photos of Aunt Ella with a girl who was clearly an Inuit or Eskimo. So I searched for Jenny again and finally found a local Jenny born in 1908. However, her father was recorded as John Coatukuluk. Yes, it turns out that Jenny Lloyd was an Inupiat Eskimo. And I finally discovered a record revealing that Uncle Lewis and Aunt Ella had adopted her. In other words, my Grandad Lloyd had an Eskimo cousin. My first cousin twice removed. I revisited the archive and found references to Jenny enjoying embroidery and harvesting cranberries. But then I found a reference to Lewis and Ella keeping Jenny's bedroom in the cabin exactly how it had been. An emergency visit to Norvik Hospital, and then a reference to Jenny, quote, crossing the Great Divide, as we Alaskans call it. She died on the 14th of August, 1921, aged just 13. Who'd have thought that the family tree would join the dots between Brooklyn, Beaver Castle, Bishop Auckland, Bakelite, Buckinghamshire and biplanes, not to mention the Fleet Prison and the Flying Dutchman, Marylebone and Moscow, Kerala and Kobuk, and that it would join more dots between Nancy Mitford and Richard III, Nellie Melba and Mantovani, Danish pilots and Chinese pirates. When it all started, I certainly didn't expect any cameo appearances by elephants, flying fish or pet cows photographed by Cecil Beaton, or quite so many shipwrecks. If it wasn't all true, I'd think it was make-believe. Thanks for watching.